like to introduce Jay Conway, who's at Cal State University, Los Angeles. Good seeing you again, Jay. It's been, about 10 years now? His talk is on the durability of a stone, Sartre on the politics and unrealizability of identity. First off, I'm sorry, would you say a little bit about yourself and your research project and how this kind of fits in, and then you can get started.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Jeff, as well as you, Henry. So grateful that the two of you organized this conference, and I've really gotten a lot from the presentations yesterday and today. The turf here is primarily transcendence of the ego to Black Orpheus. I have always wanted, though, to incorporate some details of Sartre as an interviewee into a paper. Particularly remarks that Sartre makes in the book-length series of interviews that he did with Gerasi, talking with Sartre, and then the two Rome interviews that Beauvoir conducted with him, and that are collected in Adieu. I've been intrigued for some time by Sartre's references to Spinoza, and Beauvoir's coming of age, and Didier Eribon's insult in the making of the gay self, and have informed me what I'm doing with the concept of unrealizability. Okay. A defining feature of Sartre's work is his criticism of, quote, the substantialist delusion, an array of theoretical distortions and practical evasions. A particular object, the stone or rock, was often chosen to serve as this illusion's correlate, to substantialize life, to regard life as if it were a stone. But this language of substance and stone plays more than a negative role in Sartre's thought. On the one hand, conceiving of a life as substance is deemed abstract. On the other hand, Sartre argues that understanding life requires the delineation of concrete processes of substantialization, unification, solidification. Deleuze succinctly captured this style of philosophy. Abstract first principles explain nothing, but have to themselves be explained. Such an, quote, explanation, unquote, is in fact a positive substitution, one enabling a more finely grained understanding of life and politics. Like all constants of Sartre's thought, this critique of the substantialist delusion and theme of unification resides in a prodigious difference. This includes the difference between philosophy and literature. Sartre distinguished their creative processes and their results, but he also insisted these practices were equally important, mutually dependent tests. His ideas only worked if they could be developed into philosophical concepts. The dramatic situations and characters of literature demonstrated these ideas, and their conceptual articulation were sufficiently concrete. That is, actually illuminated aspects of human life. An equally important difference, Sartre pushed his analysis of the substantialist illusion and forms of unification into new domains. There were shifts of focus, there were different interventions. Such a movement is misconstrued as monotony. Sartre kept saying the same things, as a series of discontinuous periods, or as the derivations of an original gesture. Better, the three slogans Sartre would recite in conversations: toward the concrete, to push thought away from abstract coordinates, including the insular debates of the philosophical tradition and academy; back in the soup, to re-enter the world of contemporary politics, to repoliticize one's powers as a writer; smash the bones of one's skull, to seek the limitations of one's thought, to allow social reality to penetrate, challenge, and modify one's intellectual habits. Consciousness, Sartre remarked, is not a self-enclosed, quote, inner life, but a continual, quote, sliding beyond itself. The same can be said for Sartre's work. And just like consciousness, there's no getting into Sartre's work besides being, quote, seized by a whirlwind and thrown back outside. Our relationship to Sartre's work can only be a relationship to the world. The substantialist illusion. Invariance and completeness are associated with a variety of philosophical expressions: substance, essence, nature, self-identity. But a defining conviction of Sartre's thought is human life's irreducibility to such principles. Sartre criticizes the substantialist illusion, describing consciousness as a, quote, refusal to be a substance. He insists on the difference between existence and essence, distances himself from the concept of human nature, and contrasts the unification life does display with the logic of identity or perfect adequacy. Against reification and resignation, the sigh, it is what it is, Sartre insists existence is a matter of being what one is not and of not being what one is. Sartre does, however, emphasize the reality of identifications. They are not imaginary, simply how others imagine us. This would be a version of the substantialist illusion. How others define us is imaginary in contrast to our inner truth. A related version, identifications are true or false depending upon whether they recognize or misrecognize who we are deep inside. For Sartre, a fundamental feature of everyday life is being defined in substantializing ways. And in that precise sense, we are how we are identified. These identities are discovered not as inner truths, as if we were a substance, but through language, as what others predicate of us. This is not done passively, but as a never-ending series of negotiations. The meaning the identifications have for us, the way we respond to them, is inseparable from our effort to live a particular way, what Sartre calls a, quote, original project. Here, Sartre's explicit term of comparison is Spinoza's Metaphysics. Let us recall that a message of Spinoza's monism is precisely the non-substantial, modal character of human existence. Similarly, for Sartre, the origin in original project is a, quote, non-substantial absolute. But Spinoza's concept of substance, an immanent cause fully expressed by each attribute, is for Sartre useful for capturing an important dimension of existence. Quote, to be is to unify oneself in the world. Life's immanent cause, the meaning of a life, is a specific way of being or the ongoing effort to achieve this way of being. This cause is fully expressed by each project and by each negotiation of identification. Life as original project, as a unification through difference rather than a being toward death. This time citing Spinoza's Think Least of Death, Sartre remarked, quote, projects do not encompass death, so why mention it? The durability of a stone. The image of a rock is as a prominent feature of Sartre's work as any piece of philosophical terminology. What is the substantialist illusion? Regarding existence as if it possessed the character of stone, solid, dense, permanent. Sartre described the notion of the ego as inner substance as a theoretical projection of something rock-like into consciousness. Elsewhere, the tendency to describe consciousness as a container, along with the related epistemology and dualisms, mind-body, mind-world, is juxtaposed with the image of a rock in the belly of a goose. Being is swallowed by, reduced to consciousness. To know is to eat. What consciousness knows immediately is what's in its belly, ideas, but perhaps some objects have not been digested or assimilated. Perhaps some of these ideas represent objects existing outside of consciousness. Another passage, Sartre remarks that thinking of the human body as if it were not conscious is thinking of it as if it were a rock. This theoretically kills the body as one of its limbs is physically killed when severed from its living unity. There is the image of a rock resting at the bottom of a stream. Sartre declares we are neither the rock, a constant behind change, nor the stream. The only thing constant is change. The abstract dichotomy of identity or difference conceals the way life is a display of both. Diverse acts of consciousness performed by one human body, multiple acts of consciousness coalescing around a unitary object, the flow of consciousness with its retentions and anticipations, a permanently incomplete movement whose situation includes substantializing identifications, the retroactive unifications of life produced through reflection and narration. The project is a unified meaning behind a plurality of actions. The original project is the meaning of a plurality of projects, the unity of praxis, the unity of the series, the unity of the group and fusion. But the scope of the substantialist illusion goes beyond theoretical distortion. We attempt to dodge our awareness of being a freedom by thinking of and describing ourselves as rock-like. I could never do something like that. We can appeal to a rock-like inner nature, this is who I am deep down inside, to evade responsibility for an action. I could never do something like that. Okay, I did it, but you know that's not who I am deep down inside. Okay, I've acted this way before, but I can't help it. It's just who I am. From the rock to the stream. Yes, I did those things, but I am now a different person. Much of what is predicated of objects are not properties, but relations between these objects and particular human actors. Sartre directs the reader to a rocky countryside. Obstacle, heavy, light, climbable, worthy of a photograph, are rock's relation to particular goals, activities, lifestyles. Theoretically mistaking these predicates for human independent properties, unlikely. But the spirit of seriousness involves just such a practical conflation. Quote, the meaning of my freedom has given to the world is grasped as if it came from the world. Activities demand a certain focus, but the serious person tries to give themselves the, quote, type of existence of the rock, to lose themselves in an activity precisely to avoid thinking about it as a choice, as if the activity were a property of their objective environment. Why am I doing this? Because of the way things are, or because it is what needed to be done, or because it is the right thing to do. The most striking critique of the substantialist illusion is found in the political register. Life in general involves an effort to live in a particular way with all the definition, unity, and stability this entails. But this general existential structure should not be confused for any of its heterogeneous manifestations, especially for the solidification displayed by reactionary politics. In Childhood of a Leader, Lucian is acutely aware of his existence, his inherent incompleteness, and adopts various strategies for feeling, quote, hard and heavy as a rock. Quote, that's how I should be, a rock, as he chooses what Sartre sarcastically calls leadership, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the role of boss. Later, in Reflections on the Jewish Question, or Anti-Semite and Jew, Sartre describes the anti-Semite as, quote, attracted to the durability of a stone. This reactionary project is also to be distinguished from the more general way individuals can find shelter in political groupings, just as they can find shelter behind a rock. Quote, these new kinds of rocks make themselves into rocks by their reciprocal pledges. Metaphysics and politics. Near the end of Reflections on the Jewish Question, Sartre distinguishes metaphysics from social criticism. The subject of the former, the human condition and its concomitant anxiety. The subject of the latter, relations of subjugation, including the lived experience of the subjugated. Metaphysical inquiry, Sartre informs the reader, is the luxury of the privileged. The time for metaphysics is after the emancipation of the working class. Was Sartre announcing a shift in his own trajectory? The philosophy of existence is being suspended. Thought will now be political engagement. Without question, this is a moment of Sartre getting in the soup, but this should not be understood as the appearance of a political dimension in work that was previously apolitical. The philosophical portrait of anti-Semitism developed in Reflections builds upon the earlier literary portrait found in Childhood of a Leader. In Being in Nothingness, a recurring example of the reality and unrealizability of identifications is being classified as Jewish and the experience of being so classified. Going further back, The transcendence of the ego is itself a movement from the theoretical to the practical to the political. For the abstract notion of the ego as a substantial or formal interior principle, Sartre substitutes a concrete version. The ego is not a principle discovered through introspection, but one produced through a specific kind of reflection, the unification of emotional states, actions, and qualities, along with the positing of a transcendent cause of this unity. The contents of the unity are interpreted as properties of a substance. In Nausea, it is the practice of biography and autobiography that produces the ego through the retroactive imposition of a unified narrative. Both the literary and philosophical presentation effectively short-circuit the distinction between one's identity and how one is identified. There is only the practice of identification, a practice we direct at our own life and the lives of others. In the conclusion of Transcendence, Sartre asserts that the side of the ego is, quote, not so much theoretical as practical. The author sees himself as pushing the philosophical critique of the substantialist cogito, the critiques of Locke, Hume, and Kant, into the concrete non-theoretical stronghold of the substantialist illusion. We can try to persuade ourselves that we are built in a manner precluding a range of action. I could never do something like that. In the final paragraph, Sartre explicitly positions his critique of the traditional ego as important for a leftist politics. The traditional notion of the ego is a form of political idealism because its focus on thought comes at the expense of the world. Again, consciousness swallows the world. The objects of consciousness are construed as ideas rather than a social world containing immiseration. Action is construed as the product of free will, an interior faculty, ignoring the degree to which the physical and social world informs and resists the choices our bodies make. In contrast, a notion of consciousness freed from the notion of inner life, a philosophy where embodiment is the explanation of the unity and individuality of consciousness, can serve as a foundation for a, quote, ethics and politics that is absolutely positive. In short, Sartre's philosophy was never metaphysical or purely metaphysical in the way this is defined at the end of Reflections. Alternatively, Sartre was from the outset interested in politicizing metaphysics, which is to say repoliticizing a dimension of philosophy that had become increasingly apolitical. Inauthenticity and the political. Levinas was among the first to emphasize that Sartre's critique of anti-Semitism is distinctive precisely because of the author's application of his concept of existence. Drawing on his theory of emotion, anti-Semitism is defined as a situated and embodied choice to experience the world in a particular way. A substantializing notion of Jewishness is projected onto others, whether configured as race, the occupied zone, or as a culture, Vichy. Being defined as Jewish is being defined as inescapably Jewish. Moreover, the myth of a substantial Jewish character is bound up with the mythical notion of national identity. Those possessing the former are an unassimilable threat to the latter. As Balabar has underscored, this anti-Semitic notion of incompatible, self-identical cultures is a model for contemporary anti-immigration discourse. Sartre's polemic is in fact directed at two forms of nationalism: anti-Semitic French nationalism and Gaullist nationalism. In his speech following the liberation of Paris, de Gaulle advanced the myth that an undivided French citizenry, represented by a small but centralized resistance under his leadership, was, through the expulsion of the Germans, restoring the nation to its true identity, quote, the real France, the eternal France. Sartre saw this mythical representation of the liberation as a convenient way of ignoring French anti-Semitism leading up to and during the occupation. That the very idea of national identity is in truth the rhetorical personification of the nation is a familiar observation. Consider critiques of the notion of a general will. From a Sartrean perspective, however, the principle of self-identity explains neither the nation nor the person. To personify the nation is in reality to substantialize the nation in the way persons are substantialized. One could just as well say that personhood is nationalized. Membership in a self-identical nation constitutes the very nature of a person. Sartre describes the choice of anti-Semitism as an invasion, as cowardice, and as a choice to solidify oneself, to be a, quote, pitiless stone, needing to feel big, needing to feel like an indispensable feature of the world. The anti-Semite evades contingency. The anti-Semite also evades ethics, the form of the good. Instead of negation being in the service of a positive good, the creation of new social relations, the good is conceived as a restoration to be accomplished through the negation of a population. The anti-Semite fears rationality, the form of truth, clinging to the reciprocal myths of Jewish character and national identity. Anti-Semitic views are expressed not for the sake of discovering their limitations, to smash the bones of one's own skull, but to feel big and intimidate others. Sartre actually presents us with different forms of inauthenticity, and a major theme of reflections is their difference in relationship. Along with the figure of the anti-Semite, there is the figure, an echo, an empty noise that casually pretends to share the anti-Semitic worldview in order to fit in and get ahead. There is the figure, the Democrat, that obscures the social relation of anti-Semitism through an abstract universalism, we're all human, and or abstract individualism, every individual is unique. Even when this gesture is a critical response to anti-Semitic remarks, it has the effect of deflecting attention away from a feature of our collective situation. But the principal opposition within the category of inauthenticity is between these three versions of inauthenticity and Jewish inauthenticity. Sartre identifies ways those situated as Jews try to avoid their own awareness of the situation. Throughout the book, inauthentic operates as a term of criticism, but Sartre places responsibility for Jewish inauthenticity squarely on the shoulders of the other figures in the book. For Sartre, an adequate account of the racist choice must capture its inauthenticity, along with the kinds of inauthenticity and the sense of psychological damage it engenders in its victims. Claude Lanzmann highlighted this aspect of Sartre's book, describing how Sartre's portrait of the inauthentic Jew delivered him from his own feelings of guilt. These stemmed from an episode where he abandoned his mother, fearing they were about to be arrested by the Gestapo. Quote, I was all the more moved because if Sartre, the greatest French writer, understood us as no one else ever had, he never condemned. The politics of authenticity and becoming revolutionary. Reflections also contains one of Sartre's most direct presentations of the concept of authenticity. Contra anti-Semitic cowardice, authenticity, quote, demands much courage and more courage. To be expected, Sartre incorporates political awareness, quote, true and lucid consciousness of the situation, and political struggle, quote, authenticity manifests itself in revolt, into the concept. We know from the account of anti-Semitic inauthenticity, this politics must involve a commitment to reason and a positive political project. These conditions apply whether or not one is identified as Jewish. Sartre does, however, make several remarks specific to Jewish authenticity. These remarks are highly general precisely because authenticity is for Sartre unrepresentable. Like any, quote, authentic man, the authentic Jew, quote, escapes description. One can describe a particular way of living, but authenticity, the effort of individuals to make their life their own, entails pluralism. In addition, Sartre was sensitive about reproducing the notion of a self-identical Jewish culture, given the role such an idea plays within anti-Semitic discourse. His previous discussion of the unrealizability of the identification Jewish also precluded him from positing the existence of a describable unitary experience of being identified as Jewish. In fact, his portrait of the Jew is multiple portraits because how one lives being identified as Jewish does not follow directly and uniformly from the identification itself. Sartre does nevertheless state that the authentic response to being identified as Jewish is, quote, to make oneself Jewish. Later in Saint Genet, Sartre would describe a conversion of making of oneself that turns on the appropriation and reevaluation of a disparaging, substantializing identification, thief. Jewish authenticity was described in similar terms. Making oneself Jewish goes beyond a courageous awareness of and revolt against one's situation, being classified as Jewish with all its material implications. There is an appropriation or reworking of the identification. This aspect of authenticity, as it is defined in reflection, should be kept in mind when considering Sartre's definition of the negritude movement in Black Orpheus. After all, Césaire coined the term negritude by deliberately refashioning a racial epithet into an affirmative defiant gesture. The repudiation of the substantialist illusion, including the idea of a racial nature, is behind Sartre's definition of negritude as an esquissus or conversion. Through the medium of poetry, a new notion of being Black is created. This includes the creation of a discursive Africa, quote, an imaginary continent, but this creative movement has as its supplement the rhetoric of estrangement, discovery, and recovery. One might anticipate Sartre would characterize this as inauthentic, treating it as he did Jewish inauthenticity. Those who are not situated as Black are responsible for Black inauthenticity. In fact, he judges the poetry of negritude as authentic and justifies this move by subsuming the counter definition of Blackness in a concept of the revolutionary process. In Materialism and Revolution, written between Reflections and Black Orpheus, Sartre had stressed the gap between being oppressed, the working class in itself, and becoming revolutionary, the working class for itself. This conversion occurs within and under the influence of material circumstances, but is not a necessary consequence of these circumstances. Revolutionaries project themselves toward a different world, a non-existent but imagined future. In Black Orpheus, Sartre positions the production of substantializing counter-definitions as a necessary but provisional stage of worker emancipation, a gesture hinted at in his earlier treatment of Jewish authenticity. These counter-definitions play a therapeutic function, enabling individuals to work through the psychological damage of being racialized. Such work and anti-racist work by those identified as white are for Sartre prerequisites for working class solidarity for the revolutionary subject. And is this aspect of Sartre's definition of negritude an imposition? From the perspective of Senghor's notion of race, a reproduction of the idea of racial difference as a biological, psychological, behavioral nature, it certainly seems like an imposition. But Sartre's assertion that the poets of negritude, quote, know very well, unquote, that is, know the counter-substantiation of Blackness is a provisional strategy, is not entirely misplaced. In Culture and Civilization, Césaire struggles to formulate a notion of Black culture as a dynamic, open, synchronic, and diachronic difference. He does so after immediately dismissing the idea of a trans-historical, homogeneous, insular notion of Blackness as a fiction. Furthermore, Césaire's poetic affirmation of negritude in Notebook for a Return to a Native Land is a series of increasingly expansive universal identifications. Through the narrator's solidaristic identification, Jews, poor whites, all of the oppressed past and present are pulled into the category of Blackness. In some respects, Sartre's argument for counter-substantiation captures a prominent tendency within contemporary leftist politics, the circulation of counter-identifications as principles of explanation or therapeutic necessities. For this reason, it is worth emphasizing that for social theorists informed by the Sartrean model, it is a questionable move. Fanon presents the reader with a narrative of lived experience. A man objectified and disparaged as Black tries to lose himself in an equally mythical, positive notion of Blackness. The narrator, quote, another me, is attempting to, quote, grasp my being, that is, to realize the positive notion of Blackness in all its, quote, wretched romanticism. But this ascesis, Sartre's process of counter-substantialization, does not work if you know that this positive notion of Blackness is a construction rather than one's inner truth. Quote, I needed not to know. In the narrative, the encounter with Sartre's essay shatters the protagonist's, quote, last illusion. Of course, Fanon's argument is not that for therapeutic reasons we should avoid questioning counter-substantializations. Throughout the book, Fanon presents disparaging and positive notions of Blackness as aspects of the same social pathology, the latter a symptom rather than an effective therapeutics. The principal target is the practice of racialization within capitalism and colonialism, specifically the way it substantializes existence. To exist is to belong to a race. After quoting the opening of Black Orpheus, Fanon responds, if I utter a great shout, it won't be black. His self-identification being nothing more than a perpetual questioning. This gesture can be profitably compared to James Baldwin's critical interrogation of Senghor's and Césaire's speeches at the 1956 Congress of Black Artists and Writers. Baldwin calls into question the epistemological, political, and aesthetic value of the idea of a transnational Black culture, and as well as its companion notions, white culture, European culture, and calls into question the very idea of culture in general. In his critique of Bantu philosophy, an influence on Senghor's version of negritude, Fanon warns against substituting positive stereotypes for negative ones, or worse, building a positive notion of Blackness out of long-standing stereotypes. A parallel gesture can be found in Beauvoir's account of the polarity displayed by the mythological representation of womanhood and old age, as well as in her sustained critique of the way being situated as a woman means being reduced to being a woman. Whatever the context, one is seen as expressing oneself as a woman. For Beauvoir and Fanon, the great contribution of Sartrean criticism is not his endorsement of counter-substantialization, but the more fundamental distinction between existence and substance, between the social reality of identifications and their unrealizability. This, and Sartre's complex theme of freedom and non-freedom, a theme indicative of his steadfast opposition to the concept of free will. This theme's consistency can be summarized as a set of three convictions. First, the meaning objective environments have for human beings is not a property of those environments. Quote, the very meaning of a slave's chains will appear to him in the light of the end which he will have chosen. Second, political environments can change in ways that render small actions and inactions consequential. This in turn can heighten our awareness of our freedom. Quote, never were we freer than under the German occupation. Finally, the freedom that is consciousness accents the extent to which the lives of conscious bodies are currently a remarkable display of non-freedom. Quote, it would be childish or despicable to tell a shoe stitcher or the worker who puts the needles in the speedometers of Ford cars that amid the action they are involved in, they retain the inner freedom of thought. Thanks.